Daniel Wild from the IPA joins us now. Daniel, welcome to Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me.
You've written in the Aussie Life section of the Spectator magazine this week. Now, your piece is about these disastrous Aboriginal cultural heritage laws in Western Australia. But before we talk about that specifically, you made an excellent point in your opening paragraph that the link between city and country is dying in every state. Now, most of our laws, if we're honest, are made by city-based politicians on the advice of city-based focus groups. Is this disconnect creating unworkable policy?
It absolutely is, Alexandra. There's, as you say, the people that are making the policy, advising on the policy and communicating policy have often never spent any time in regional Australia, much less on a farm or on a mining site. And there's a real disconnect between city and country where many farmers and food producers just feel like they're being taken for granted basically by city-based bureaucrats and politicians. Now, the problem with this is the wellspring of our prosperity as a nation, but also one of the backbones of our culture is actually regional Australia. You know, these are people that are embedded in their local communities. They live lives that are based on the real production of produce and of products, and they earn the critical export revenue that then funds all of the schools, roads and hospitals and everything else that we benefit from as a community. So there is a growing divide, and I think that that's showing up with these cultural heritage laws where clearly the Western Australian government has just got the community sentiment completely wrong.
Well, that's very well said. Now, these infamous Aboriginal cultural heritage laws in Western Australia are so badly done that within weeks of them coming into force, there was not one but two tree planting initiatives essentially cancelled, with one Aboriginal body empowered to seek $2.5 million for the approval. Is this a mistake or the product of badly designed law?
Look, it's a natural consequence of the law. Something like this was always going to happen. It is farmers that will be most affected and miners. But of course, it goes beyond that, because any property that's greater than 1,100 square metres, which is just a bit more than a quarter-acre block, is within the purview of these laws. Now, think about what that means. For some people, that's their residential house. But it's also things like sporting ovals, sporting clubs, golf courses, resorts, pubs, tourist attractions. Just think about in your life how many things that you would go to or interact with that are on a piece of land that's greater than a quarter-acre block. There's literally thousands of things. So this will affect the life of every single Western Australian in one form or another. The tree planting situation was just one example, basically the first cab off the rank. And this is what happens. I mean, there was no proper consultation about how these laws will work. The government over there had basically decided that they were going to go ahead no matter what the consequences were. But the key point that I want to make is we have seen a lot of community pushback against this, and a lot of leadership, firstly from the Pastoralists and Graziers Association, which is headed up by Tony Seabrook in WA, and they sort of belled the cat on this, and they've really brought the community along with them. And we're seeing that when you have leadership and when you make an argument, you can actually get bad policies to potentially be deferred and ideally removed.
Well, on that point, the IPA has been driving around communities impacted by these laws. What's the general feeling among farmers and landholders? Are they concerned about the future of the value of their land and what they can and can't do?
Yeah, look, the basic feeling is anger, very deep anger and frustration in these communities because they're not being listened to. And one of the insinuations of these laws is that they don't care about what happens on their land. In this case, in relation to Indigenous heritage, but this is just the latest in a long line of attacks on farmers, whether it's to do with the environment or climate or many other animal welfare. But what we know is it's the farmers who care the most. I mean, they need their land to be productive. And what that means is you take care of the environment, you do the right thing by the animals and their welfare. And every farmer that we met with on our trip cares deeply about Indigenous heritage and wants to do the right thing by the local Indigenous community there. But the problem is that what these WA heritage laws would do is set up a brand new, unaccountable and unelected bureaucratic infrastructure that would basically undermine any notion of private property. There'd be hundreds of thousands of dollars just associated with consulting with a local Indigenous elder in relation to potential cultural heritage on that site, let alone all the other issues that are there. So the overwhelming feeling was anger and frustration, and also a feeling of betrayal and having been taken advantage of yet again by these city-based politicians.
Yes, well, I don't think it was mentioned or highlighted in the last election that this would be part of the deal. And the Liberal opposition leader can't seem to decide what to do. On the one hand, she tweets that her party will scrap the laws if they get into power. And on the other, they say that the Liberal Party agrees with the gist of the laws and will seek to merely amend them. Now, I don't know, Daniel, did you get the feeling that rural communities want these laws gently pruned or thrown into the shredder?
They definitely want these laws removed, Alexandra. There's no doubt about that. And look, this is the key point. We've seen some pushback and we've seen a deferral to elements of the laws, which has been very important, and I think a victory for those on the ground. But these laws are so broken and so rotten that really they need to be dispensed with completely. Now, everybody is in favour of protecting Indigenous heritage, but there needs to be a proper way of going about it that actually takes into consideration the needs of farmers on the ground. Because don't forget, I mean, these are the people that feed the nation, they feed the world, you know, they send our produce overseas to nourish those who are in much worse off conditions than we are. We're also in the middle of a cost of living crisis with inflation at 6 or 7%. If you put more regulation and more red tape on farmers who are already heavily regulated, then you're going to get higher costs, and as anybody will tell you, that's going to flow through to the consumer. It's going to be higher prices at the checkout, further feeding this problem that we have. So, look, the ramifications of these laws are not just contained to those individual farmers, they will permeate right through to everyone else in the community.
Well, let me put this to you, because this is based on comments that I've seen come through online. As you rightly wrote in The Spectator, the way these laws have been worded means that Aboriginal heritage can apply to pretty much anything it wants to. Doesn't this leave open the possibility of unfairness? Because if one Indigenous body likes a certain organisation, they could give them a free pass on approvals while demanding cumbersome and expensive approval processes for another. Now, that doesn't seem to be particularly transparent, open or fair.
Yeah, you've identified something very important, which is with all the issues of this law, one of the key ones is the opaque nature of it and the lack of transparency. If you look at the legislation, what it actually refers to in terms of Indigenous heritage is intangible matters. So it talks about tangible, which might be a cave or a rock formation, and you might say, okay, fair enough, I can understand how that might exist and how you might need to manage that. But then it also talks about intangible matters and spiritual matters, which are subjective and are in the eye of the beholder. There's no way that a farmer would be able to satisfy those requirements because it's not known. It's like if you're driving down the road and a policeman pulls you over for going over the speed limit, but there's no speed sign on the road. It's a basic principle of the rule of law that the law has to be knowable and transparent for it to be fair. So if you don't even know how this law could operate, you can't comply with it. And so it sets up, as you say, all of these potential conflicts and problems down the road.
Well, it's still being cheered on by the inner city Gen Zs. Maybe the farmers should put them on a slight diet and see how they go with the laws after a little while. But there are associations moving against these laws, and indeed the existence of them is openly harming the Voice campaign along with Labor's state popularity, which a recent poll showed. What do you think at the IPA the future holds? Do you think there's going to be more laws, or they're going to be sent back for a rethink, or is Western Australia stuck with these heritage laws?
Look, I think these laws will be repealed ultimately, at least in terms of the substance of them. It's untenable. The position that the government there is now in is untenable. It's not just farming communities, but the broader community has well and truly turned against the government there on the back of these laws. As you identified, this is also poison for the voice to Parliament. I mean, this is already happening without a voice. Think about how worse things will be when there is a voice to Parliament, because this is exactly the kind of thing that the voice to Parliament will be involved in. At the federal level, we've seen the government push for similar laws. Last year, there was a review into Indigenous cultural heritage on the back of the Rio Tinto when they exploded the Juukan Gorge in last year, there was a review there. The government basically agreed to all the recommendations other than one that was undertaken in that review, which would give them wide-ranging powers. Now, what's really interesting is that Tanya Plibersek, the Environment Minister, has basically kicked that into the long grass, having seen what has happened in Western Australia, having seen the impact on the government and the impact on the voice. The federal government is clearly not wanting to go anywhere near that. So, look, I think these laws will be rolled back in due course, but it will take some time to get there.
Well, Australia's thoughts are with the Western Australian farmers. It's not hard enough to earn a living at the moment and feed the nation. They have to contend with what is essentially a tax on doing business. So, look, thank you very much for the work the IPA does and for going around and listening to these people and for helping to hopefully dismantle what amounts to bad legislation. So thank you very much, Daniel.